Thanks for joining us for the first season of Unfair Housing. We hope you enjoyed our discussion so far. We've covered a great deal of ground this season to help give you a better understanding of what caused housing segregation, and in turn created a wealth gap and homeownership gap between white and Black Americans that persists today. We began our journey in our prologue episode by discussing the slave trade and corresponding slave codes. Slave codes significantly stripped the enslaved Black population of their freedoms to participate in just about anything, and kept them from being able to make most of their own decisions. But the enslaved were not the only Black people struggling with land ownership and economic equality, because even non-slaves and former slaves had their rights infringed by local laws or practices. Access to opportunity began to improve some during the Reconstruction era following the end of the Civil War, when Congress ratified the 13th Amendment in late 1865, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. But even following the end of slavery, those who were free still did not have equal protection under the law like their white counterparts, due to the passage of local laws, often referred to as Black codes, which had similar effects as slave codes. In response to the passage of Black codes, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the precursor to the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and extended the right to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey land and personal property to all citizens of every race and color. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 also protected all citizens from discrimination based on race. Similarly, the 14th Amendment prohibited limitations on a person's life, liberty, or property and promised equal protection under the law. However, these laws also left a lot of room for interpretation, which at this particular point in history left the rights of Black Americans unprotected. And as more federal laws were passed to give rights to Black Americans, state and local opposition rose. Likely the most important example was the rise of the Jim Crow South, which, much like Black codes, were laws designed to ensure Black Americans remained inferior, and they allowed significant elements of slavery to remain. They also played a major role in segregation. Jim Crow laws really took hold, not just in the South but across the country, following the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which stated separate but equal is constitutional. This decision resulted in segregated public and private spaces, including schools, parks, theaters, and housing. Implementation of Jim Crow laws and growing violence in the South prompted Black Southerners to relocate to the North and West, which made many current white residents uncomfortable and reactionary. Following the Supreme Court decision on the unconstitutionality of race-based zoning laws, white homeowners began using restrictive covenants and warranty deeds that prohibited the transfer of property from a white homeowner to a Black homeowner, and even prohibited renting to Black tenants. Northerners also banded together to openly protest Black families moving into white neighborhoods, and began engaging in violent and destructive behaviors similar to those engaged in by white Southerners. But with severe reactions to Black Americans gaining equity and Black Americans migrating north and west, came impactful stories of heroism. Monumental progress was made toward advancing equity for Black Americans thanks to people who stood up against intimidation and violence and demanded they be treated equally. It's so important to remember the real heroes like Maurice and Wilbur Gary, who stood their ground and refused to leave their home in a white neighborhood in California, knowing it could cost them their lives or their well-being. The Shorts, who did the same in their California neighborhood, but who paid the ultimate sacrifice in the name of freedom for Black Americans. The Clarks, who tried to rent an apartment in Cicero, an all-white neighborhood in Chicago, despite facing intimidation and harassment initially, sought judicial intervention to move in, only to have their belongings thrown from the building and burned by an angry white mob. The Moores, who helped Black Floridians register to vote and investigated every lynching they could in Florida, which cost them their lives and dramatically impacted the lives of their two surviving daughters. And the Wades, Bradens, and all those in Kentucky who came to their aid and lost their reputations, homes, and livelihoods, and were made political martyrs during a time when communism was used as a tool to eliminate civil rights activism. All were incredible people who just wanted to live in a democracy, in a freer world. They wanted everyone to live in a neighborhood of their choice, raise a family, and have a chance to succeed, regardless of the color of their skin. Their tenacity changed the outcome of history and shifted policies and practices in the United States closer to racial equity. Unfortunately, housing programs under the New Deal implemented by then-President FDR did not bring such equity. Red line maps were created to determine which neighborhoods were sufficient for investment. The FHA's federal mortgage insurance program used these maps to keep Black Americans from having access to secure mortgage products from credible lenders by refusing to insure mortgages made to Black Americans. When the VA began insuring mortgages, it did the same. Also under the New Deal, the government further segregated Blacks and whites when it established programs to develop public housing, which either had separate complexes for Blacks and whites or separated them by buildings or different entrances. Not long after federal public housing programs were implemented, programs were created to encourage white homeownership in the suburbs, so white residents and their tax dollars began to flee from urban cities to more idyllic and segregated suburbs like Levittown and Long Island, New York. Once these New Deal policies and prohibitions on integration took hold, the remaining Black neighborhoods deteriorated. The government labeled these areas as blighted and bulldozed them to make way for public spaces, higher income housing, and highways. In 1948, the Supreme Court again took a step to reduce segregation by determining race-related restrictive covenants utilized predominantly in white suburbs were unconstitutional. But segregation policies and programs enacted by both Congress and the executive branch continued to disinvest from Black neighborhoods despite the promises afforded by the 14th Amendment. In addition to the many obstacles Black Americans faced when trying to seek housing, much of our journey also had a correlation to employment opportunities for Black Americans following slavery, which have lasted well into the 21st century. Even once slavery was abolished, Black workers were confined to mostly agriculture and service positions, both by law and to some extent through union regulations. Black Americans also received less opportunities for education, often forced to attend poorly funded, segregated schools, and for a time were actually pulled out of school to work in the fields to harvest crops. These circumstances and disadvantages, for one, had a direct impact on acquiring wealth, but also had significant impact on where and under what conditions Black families lived. Thank you for joining us this season. We'll be taking a break over the rest of the summer, and we'll return in the fall with more on the history of housing segregation leading up to the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968. We hope you return next season when we'll discuss a few more topics on the history of housing segregation and how they, along with the topics we've discussed this season, led to the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act and requirements under the law such as affirmatively furthering fair housing. But as you'll see in future discussions, the passage of the Fair Housing Act, while a helpful and necessary tool to combat housing discrimination, has not reversed the harm caused by discriminatory housing practices engaged in by the government, private industry, and segregationists throughout history. We hope you have enjoyed this journey so far. If so, be sure to subscribe so you'll be notified when we return for Season 2. Also be sure to give us a like, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, and share our information with your friends and family. Also as a reminder, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you would like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. That's 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. That's 800-405-1417. See you next season.